guys seem to say
yeah.
that
She just loved it. She wore it until she
they put enough emphasis on depravity,
but no,
or
it's
the fact that
not
once
hard.
you're saved, you
It's
still have
just,
the indwelling sin.
I
Romans
think it's
7.
harder drawing up the
So
grid
I'm
to know
I'll send
where the
you the link.
stitches have to fall.
When you're making your own.
Shows you.
Yeah.
I had looked at ones I want to do for the family crest.
There's
And I'm
David
like,
Policy.
I need to go somewhere.
Is,
I know Sally at the Clever U I
as
made.
it's
And
something
she has a
on
wonderful
you say,
yarn shop,
the first
expensive yarns, okay?
right
But
after
see,
Jay
I've never
Adams
gone
was
to
the
that.
biblical counsel,
so she helped me get,
he's,
I saw this one
well
water
known,
once.
well
That
respected.
you
Have a
just
lot of
crochet
big
with
books out
thread.
there.
It has 3
Book came home.
snowmen. It says let it snow.
Like I said, that's what
I said,
alerted
Sally,
me.
I
And
want that. I'm so
I was looking on the book.
So she found the pattern. Of course, I bought the thread.
And Steve
That
told
was
me
the
in that
easiest
break,
thing to
well, there's
crochet
a
with,
reason.
and I had no idea.
And he said something
But
in a
I
nutshell.
like to go there. I used to be
Christ
taught how to
sanctification.
make the pattern like that.
So I
Because
heard
this
that
one, I
again,
don't
this
think I'm going
guy's
to find it
gonna
already
teach me.
printed somewhere.
So,
Yeah.
but that's one guy.
And depending on how
Still,
intricate it, the
there's that
easiest way
thing
is just to
bugging me.
take graph
Yeah.
paper.
Sure.
It's already
And
got
I
lines
think
on
the
it.
Holy
Yeah.
Spirit puts that there. What you
I don't know that they
Sometimes.
maybe someplace sell it anymore. Things have changed so much over the
I've
years.
seen craft paper.
But I know you can
Howdy.
get it off the
Matt.
internet.
Good
You
to see
can
you.
print it off the internet.
Okay.
And
Made it
then
in
you
on
sit
the
there
rain.
and
Yeah, a little soggy,
With,
but not too bad.
pencil.
Not as
That's
bad as
a
it
really
could
good
be.
idea.
Right?
You know,
How about
just sit there
those
and
poor
play with it.
souls
You can
down
see
in
when it's
Florida?
very
Panhandle,
long,
Florida?
and you can
Oh,
see
yeah.
150 mile an hour winds.
Pencil.
Yeah. I know. I was watching the Weather Channel.
Do you do anything with like quilting or anything like
That's
that?
nasty.
Well, so
I said to
all
my
my
wife, why would
skills
you
are
move down
old
to,
fashioned skills.
No, but I like that.
well, because there's no
I
tax
was
on
raised like
retirement.
that.
Yeah.
My grandmother's one taught me
And
crochet in
that's-
senior
that's
year of
why a
high
lot of
school.
folks
I
go
did
down
some of
in the
Girl
winter.
Scouts and 4-H,
I
okay?
know
Mhm.
it's- yeah, but
Those old Granny Square vests, you know, we used to wear. and stuff. You put them in the fair for,
Yeah.
and, you know.
some insurance companies are covered.
My senior year of high
Funny, they're
school,
all
I wanted to
usually
go to Granny
atheists when it
Square.
comes to that. It's an active job to move your house over.
Yeah.
So I'm there, and she goes, "No, rip it out. It's not even enough." Do you know how many times? So I'm, you know, as much as it was hard for me, I
Mhm.
appreciated that
Mhm.
because it taught me the proper way to hold everything. I hold my needle different. Some people go like this with their crochet hook, right?
No.
The other way. See, that's not.
I'd have to think of it.
I can hold like you hold a pen almost.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's what I do. And she told me how to hold my material, how to make it even. So I'm thankful for that because it just helps.
I wish that's the one regret, biggest regret of my childhood is my grandmother tried to teach me to knit. And I didn't realize I'm not an auditory learner and I can't learn simply by reading. I have to be able to sit there and read and do it at the same time.
Now, can you do the YouTube stuff where you watch on YouTube and then do it?
Yeah, as long as I can do it at the same time as I'm hearing it or reading it.
Okay.
And I never could learn from her, but when I got into college, there was a Woolworth's downtown. And I walked down there one day because I was bored at night and got a little 19-cent book
Oh, my son's here.
and sat there and picked it up. But I had the book and I could sit there and do it along with the book.
Oh, nice.
Picked it up just, and it always made me sad that my grandmother, who I adored, I couldn't learn from her, but I could learn from that 19-cent book.
Wow. Well, that's it. Just you saw it, you could actually do it right then and there.
That's how I'm a kinesthetic learner, yes.
Okay.
And I never knew that till I was 38. And I had gotten I was living in San Antonio at the time, and I'd gotten a job in the controller's office at Fleming Foods. And this woman was sitting there explaining to me what my job was going to be and how to do it. And I remember thinking for the very first time in my life, when I was in high school, I could never figure out why it was so harder for me than everybody else. Because I would just sit in class and just frantically write down everything I could as fast as I could. Then, because I can't sit there and listen to it, and at night I would go home and I would rewrite it. Remember back in the day, maybe you aren't old enough.
I'm 58, going to 59 in a couple months. So. Person?
I've got kids your age.
My husband's 66.
No, my eldest daughter's 50. So.
Okay, about that age, yeah.
Yeah.
So you
Then I'd go home at night and I'd sit there and rewrite it and outline it and get it all organized. That's when it sunk in, but nobody else had to do that.
People do. My one daughter, Laura, who's a professor at Aquinas, she teaches Spanish. And my husband does that.
Mm-hmm.
He'll take the notes and he'll have to rewrite them to make sure he didn't miss out anything. I'm like, I hardly take notes. I can listen. It's like learning new music. Are you a good music fan? Yeah, you are. I'm Teresa, by the way.
Yeah.
So a lot of the songs I don't know, but I watch your mouth.
Okay.
Because I can hear, I can see his mouth, I can tell when he's going up or down, and what he's doing with his tongue, I know where the pitch is. So I can, if I hear it, I got it. I can read music too, but you're good at this, so you're easy to follow that way.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Probably no one else does that. Just me doing a weird thing, okay?
But I remember when I was listening to this woman, thinking to myself, she's just going to confuse me. When she goes away and I can get my hands on it, it'll be fine. And it was. So I just
You
tuned her
learned
out.
your way of learning. is what you did.
Yeah, finally. I was almost 40 at that.
But you know, that's why I always admire teachers. I homeschool quite a
What are you
bit.
gonna
I
do?
look at this and I'm going,
All right.
all my
I
children
think
learned math.
I'm doing better now than I was earlier.
How do you?
Oh, yeah? Why's that?
It's beyond me. But see, I was one that got math right away. So was my son. My girls are like, really, Mom?
My eldest daughter, when she was in algebra,
I
oh
love that.
my God. We must have drawn 1,000,000 miles of number lines because she just could not get negative
So
numbers.
what are we in
I just
Daniel
could
chapter 2?
I don't even know how many miles of number lines we drew.
She couldn't figure.
She could not grasp negative numbers.
See, I loved algebra. That back in the day, we did everything longhand. So when my girls got to do algebra and counting in school, I was so excited. And all of a sudden, they're pulling out these Texas instruments.
I read
and I'm
Daniel
like,
chapter 3.
Yeah.
I had no clue what I was doing. I'm like,
We're ahead of the game.
I say, I never heard 3 ahead.
I think this takes, I know it's faster, but it takes away from their ability to think and read. Those were the days. I was ready. Are you from this area then?
Mostly, yeah.
Not enough.
I'm from Hart. Okay.
I know where that is on the other side.
Area, yeah.
One of my best friends is from Hart.
Oh, really?
Her last name was Tate.
Tate?
Yeah.
I know Tate. What,
Sandra?
see, when I was a kid, we were on Bud Tate's farm, on farming land.
Okay. I
But
don't know what her
Tina
father's
Tate,
name is.
there's Mary Ellen Tate, you know Mary Ellen.
Yeah, Lee.
Jim, I think, is her father's name. Okay, yeah, there's quite a few Tates.
Have
up
to ask
there.
Sandra what
There
her
was a
last
Tate
name
funeral
was.
home, Tate funeral home.
And then she married a person
Oh.
from the area, so.
Hey, Tim,
Tim?
sorry. Could you put the camera up just a little bit? My head's chopped
To
off.
see, like,
So they can, there you go. And can you zoom out, maybe just a hair? It's a little close. Too close for my comfort. Awesome. Looks great.
I said twins.
There's 2 of them up there.
Yeah, there's 2 of them. Okay, so where do you want us? Up there or here? What?
Front and center.
How are you? See ya.
You are.
Mark.
Mark, Bob, and Teresa.
Teresa.
I asked my son in high school. How you doing?
Not too bad. How about yourself?
Okay. Ah.
I wasn't there.
Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, you guys made it in the rain.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know where.
I just sure I think it's
Where's
you guys, Todd.
Well, the motion today, they're not as good as they used to be.
Right.
Now, they're
I just remember when they landed.
I know when we lived out in the country, you know, man, we always.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, yeah, Chris.
So that's probably, that's like one thing that we.
Would your mom come to you?
Yeah.
That's not fun.
That's not just
I
position
listen to it too.
it's not a.
Like I play.
Yeah, that's what I would expect.
It's becoming more hard.
They're doing all right.
15 years out from now.
That's what
Which I think it should be.
There's not even music.
It's just little marks.
Who's next? Who's it?
So I would refer.
Central for a year. So for your training, so yeah, so me and I was not music.
And I went to Vegas, so like,
They're driving a problem.
Oh, okay.
yeah,
I don't know.
It was so
Enjoy recreation.
There you go.
So it's not a necessity, and that's why I don't feel, if there was someone who was more of a necessity,
it was like,
I would definitely send it to the one person.
he's like, sitting on my desk.
He likes using sizes.
Yes.
Why?
That's
No, it's just a talent.
I was like, maybe we don't care. I'm like,
He's
How do
so that's the best so
Yes. Yeah, so that's our corporate office.
Good, how are you? I don't I'm so glad I
Yeah, so we have a little bit of drive.
I started when I was 4.
Yeah, when the construction yeah, it's black.
Certainly not as much as I ought to.
First time coming was the end of
Probably how you play to go.
It is. As long as you don't mind sitting next to me.
Oh yeah, they're moving
What? So I'm taking it so way new. Someone else. That much. Video didn't show you got it. You're scared of falling off. Good idea. And I don't know what happened.
One and done.
I opened it up and I read it. And her they got a lot of money.
Yeah.
That's all I did.
So that's where the hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
She had this.
Okay. All right. There might be some in the back. Hey, Youngs. How you guys doing? Good. Yeah, I love that you're front and center, right in the front. It's great. Love it.
Hi, troublemakers. How are ya?
You know that about them too, huh?
Oh, yeah.
She brings out the worst. It's her fault.
Hey, Michelle. Good to see you. We'll take you.
So you're about.
Amen. All right. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. We're going to start right on time because we have a ton of material to cover tonight. So we're going to get right after it, and it's going to take us right up till 8:30 to get through all this material. So welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Great to have you all again. Come in, ladies. Come in. Come in. Good to see you. Welcome. Welcome to anyone on our screen. I don't know if anyone's back there, but I see Gary Dredge somewhere on the screen, so welcome.
He's out there.
He's out there. I know. He's watching from out there. That's awesome. Hey, Wayne. Good to see you. Thanks for coming to our conference this weekend. We had a great time with Justin. So for all of you that were here, thank you for participating and coming out. We're going to continue to do those kinds of things periodically and just continue to make that available to our church family. I should have said this on Saturday. Our next conference is in April, and we believe so far Justin Peters will be coming to our church, and he will be here the last few days of April. So after after Easter, he'll be here and do a conference for us. So we got him lined up, and then Lord willing, we'll have another conference lined up for about a year from now. So we just want to keep doing this. We have 8, 9, 10 other expositors, pastors that we can utilize. And so we're just going to keep doing those things. I hope the elders have to talk about it, but we want to continue to do that just to get other people saying the same thing that I am and the Bible is saying, and just to benefit from these men. So we're very, very grateful. So welcome back tonight. Those of you that are here for the first time, welcome. And I think you have your notes in front of you. We're in Daniel chapter 2. So if you missed last week, Cheryl should have some notes for you if you'd like to grab those so you can see her after class. And I think that's it. Any other announcements? All right, let's pray and we'll begin. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to meet together. What a joy, Lord, to come and open your word and meet together. Thank you for each person that's here. Thank you for their diligence, for their willingness to participate and learn. And we pray, Father, that you will be our teacher tonight. And we're excited to dive into this wonderful chapter. We pray for your blessing upon our discussion. Teach us, instruct us, make us more like Christ. Lord, give us a hope for your future coming kingdom. And may we love you more because of this. So, Lord, we commit our evening to you now in your name. Amen. All right, so turn in your notes to page 52. That's where we're going to pick up, or those are the notes for tonight. Yeah, so those are the notes. You got those tonight. Hold there and then go back to page 21 because we're going to just quickly rehearse the structure of these 6 chapters. So you'll remember we said Daniel chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. Daniel 2 through 7 is written in Aramaic. Daniel 8 through 12 is written in Hebrew. And so you remember back on page 21, we looked at this structure of this Aramaic portion. And so I just want to remind you of that. Kind of towards the top of page 21, you'll see that structure, vision of the 4 world empires in chapter 2. And then notice at the bottom of that little section, vision of the 4 world empires in chapter 7. And then chapters 3 and 6 are parallel, deliverance of Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace, and then deliverance of Daniel from the lion's den. And then chapters 4 and 5 are parallel, the judgment on Nebuchadnezzar and the judgment on Belshazzar. So we're entering now this Aramaic section of Daniel, and I just want you to be familiar with this parallel structure. Chapters 2 and 7 are parallel, 3 and 6 are parallel, 4 and 5 are parallel. And that's, as we said before, a chiastic pattern that really draws our attention to the center of that, chapters 4 and 5, which God brings his judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. So we'll get there eventually. But today I just want you to be aware of the fact that we're heading into chapter 2, which is parallel with chapter 7. And so just be aware of that, and we'll come back and visit chapter 7 here in a little bit. But any questions on that structure? All right, so now go back to the notes that you got tonight, and that's where we're going to begin. There is so much in this chapter, and we really need to get after it because we really have to get this done, hopefully tonight, to stay on schedule. We're actually behind schedule, so we're going to see how we do, just make up some time. This is one of the most important chapters in the Bible. You could probably say that about every chapter in the Bible. This is one of the most important. I really mean that, because what you have in Daniel chapter 2 is a prophecy about the future of the world from the time of Babylon all the way to the end. And so that's what makes this such a significant chapter, such a significant prophecy. There is so much here. And if you can wrap your minds around this chapter, you will have a framework by which you can understand what God is doing in redemptive history from 605 BC until the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ. So it is a monumental prophecy. And so we want to kind of pull it apart tonight. So I want to just dive right into this, and we're going to skip kind of through the first parts of the chapter, and then we're going to spend most of our time towards the end of the chapter. So let's just get into this. First, we want to see the failure of the king's advisor. So you remember chapter 2 is about a dream. Verse 1 says that in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream. He had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. And you can notice that the word dreams is in the plural, which means he either had several dreams or he continued to have this dream over and over and over and over again. And I'm not quite sure which one it is, but I would lean toward the fact that he only had one dream a number of times because he only has one dream interpreted. So there's only one dream that Daniel interprets for him. And so I would think that this is a dream that he continued to have repeatedly, and it troubled him. You can see it in verse 3 that it caused him great anxiety. So this dream was very troubling to him. At the bottom of page 52, I put a little section there on dreams. And I think just briefly, we need to understand that though God communicated in dreams at certain times in redemptive history, he no longer communicates in dreams today. That's my conviction. I do not believe that God communicates in any of your dreams. Okay, that may put me in the minority, but I've had that question asked many, many times over the course of 20 years of ministry. What does my dream mean? And they tell me what they had at the dream, and I said, I have no idea. Actually, I tell them it means nothing. Other than the fact that dreams are likely just your mind's way of processing what you've been thinking about during the day. That's about it. So I don't think you should read too much into your dreams. Now, God did speak through them at certain times in certain ways. Just listen to Hebrews chapter 1. And then, Joe, what were you going to say? Go ahead real quick. That's probably what it means. They had some really bad pizza that night. Listen to Hebrews 1 and 2. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. So I think the writer of Hebrews is acknowledging that sometime God spoke through dreams and God spoke through visions, and God used many different ways. He spoke through a donkey. He spoke through prophets. He used a multiplicity of ways to communicate himself. However, verse 2 of Hebrews 1 says, in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. So I think we're past the age of dreams. We're in the age where he has spoken to us in his Son, and that is canonized for us in the Bible, which I believe is now closed. I trust you believe that as well. And so there's no need for dreams. There's no need for extra biblical revelation. There's no need for any additional revelation that we're looking for outside of God's word. So that's a question that just comes up in the discussion on dreams. Certainly God used it in Daniel 2, but is not something that you should look into today. Spurgeon said this at the bottom of the page. What if you did see an apparition or a dream? What would that prove? Why? It would prove nothing whatever, except that you were in an ill state of health and that your imagination was morbidly active. And I like that. I think that's a good way of saying what we're trying to say here is you were just thinking about things and it came out in your dreams and that's about it. Colleen, you were going to say something?
Well, I'm in total agreement with that, but I do have a question, and if you don't want to cover it, that's perfectly fine. But I'm thinking of Joel and Acts 2. Well, Acts 2 is Peter's quoting Joel, but will there come a time later when there could possibly be visions?
I think so. So the question is, will there be a time in the future where there could be dreams and visions? I think there could potentially be, particularly in the tribulation age when Revelation tells us there will be prophecy. So it is possible that in that future age, as God restores his plan with Israel, that there could be a restoration of those kinds of things. He's going to speak in prophecies, so we already know that, and perhaps he could use dreams or visions to do it then, but I don't believe that we're in that age right now. That's a great question, great clarification. Okay, so we have this dream that he has. Verses 2 and 3 tell us that he calls in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. These are his dream specialists. These are his bevy of counselors and advisors that when something like this happens, he calls and he summons them to himself, and he thinks that these people are going to be able to give him some sort of answer as to what this dream means. And it's interesting to me, he calls all four of them. He doesn't just call one or two, he calls all four. He calls the conjurers, he calls the magicians, he calls the sorcerers, he calls the Chaldeans. He calls every possible one to help him because verse 3 says he's anxious. He is troubled. He is concerned. This whole situation has deeply agitated him. And he wants to know its meaning. So he summons them and he calls them to himself to help him interpret this dream. And so they come. Verse 4 says, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And by the way, this now starts the Aramaic portion of the book. Chapter 2, verse 4, second half of it. From here through the end of chapter 7, we have all Aramaic. So up to this point, Hebrew. From here on through chapter 7, all Aramaic. Starting in chapter 8, all Hebrew. So he calls to them, or they say to him, rather, King, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. And so they say, we're happy to help you out, King, but we need to know the dream. You need to tell us the contents of the dream. Tell us what was in it. And he refuses, and you can see it in verse 5. The king answered and said, the command for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb. That's a little troubling. Not a group of guys I'm not sure I'd want to be a part of if that was the threat. So he threatens them to tear them limb from limb if they don't produce the dream and its interpretation. And yet, verse 6 says, if you declare to me the dream and its interpretation, then you'll receive gifts and rewards and all kinds of wonderful things. So here's the situation. Tell me the dream and its interpretation. And if you do, I'll bless you. And if you don't, I'm going to kill you. Great boss to work for, right? So there's the situation. And you can notice that the words dream and interpretation occur 3 times in verses 5 and 6. Tell me the dream and the interpretation, the dream and the interpretation, the dream and the interpretation. And so he's demanding not only that they interpret it, but that they tell him what it is. Some people think because of a faulty translation of the King James that he forgot it. Does anyone have a King James Bible with them? You have New Kings? What does the first phrase in verse 5 say under the quotes? Okay, so there it translates it correctly. The King James, when it was first translated, says this, the thing is gone from me. You see that in the bottom of page 53. The thing is gone from me. They interpreted that first part of that phrase in verse 5 as the thing is gone from me, meaning in their minds that maybe he forgot it. And I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think he forgot it. I think he is actually testing these guys. Look at the bottom of page 53. In verse 9, his withholding of the dream from the wise men is not because he's forgotten it, but because he desires to put them to the test. So verse 9 says, if you do not make known to me the dream, there's only one decree for you, for you've agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. So I don't think he trusts these guys. I think he's a little skeptical of them, and he's not quite sure whether they're shooting straight with him. So his thinking is this: if you really can interpret this thing and you can predict the future, then you should be able to look in the past and tell me what it was as well. So I think he's testing them a little bit.
He forgot it unless when Daniel revealed it, how would he know Daniel's telling the truth?
That's true.
Unless it kind of triggered some thought or something.
Yeah, exactly.
If he forgot it, he wouldn't be trouble.
Yeah, he clearly knew the details. And he knew that there was something at stake in this vision, this dream. So yeah, I don't think he forgot it. I think he clearly understood what it was. He just didn't know all of its meaning. So here's the situation. He threatens them. I'm on page 54 of your notes. And again, I can't go at the same depth as we went in our seminary class. So I'm skipping over some of these parts so we can get to the meat of it. So he threatens to kill them. He also threatens to bless them. 3 times these guys try to persuade him. From verse 4, you can see their first attempt to get him to tell them the dream. And then verse 7, they plead with him to tell them the contents of the dream. And then verses 10 and 11, they're pleading with him again, saying, just please tell us. Look at verse 10. It says, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on the earth who could declare the matter for the king. I love this. They are, unbeknownst to themselves, setting this whole situation up. Don't you love that? They're setting this whole thing up for Daniel. There's not a man on the earth who could do what you're asking us to do, inasmuch as there's no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this. Verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult. This is hard, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except the gods. Don't you love this? Nobody can do what you're asking us to do, King. It's impossible. No one has ever asked anybody to do what you're asking us to do. In fact, there's no one that can even do what you're asking us to do. I love it, because they don't even know what is about to take place. So here's this situation, and they're asking him to tell them the dream's contents. So the king responds, verse 12. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and he gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree goes forth that the wise men should be slain, and they look for Daniel and his friends to kill them. So they say, we can't do it. It cannot be done. So the king says, all right, we're killing you all. Love this guy. And Daniel, who is a part of this cadre of advisors, gets kind of caught up in this whole thing. All right, so here's the setting. How does Daniel respond? That's our next section, verses 14 to 23. Daniel responds, and I want you, starting in the bottom of page 54 into the next page, there are 3 responses that Daniel gives. And just by way of application, we would do well to respond to these kind of situations in the same way that Daniel does. So the first response is a wise response. Look at verse 14. He says, then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment. Don't you love that? There's a death sentence out against him. And you might maybe be a little scared at that moment, but Daniel replies with discretion and discernment. He replied wisely. He spoke wisely. He didn't panic. He knew and trusted God's sovereignty. And I would ask you, when life throws you a curveball, do you panic? Absolutely. I think if we're all honest, most of us have this sense of panic that sets in. And here's Daniel, just calm, confident, trusting the Lord, speaking wisely. And he goes in and asks of the king that he would give him time in order to declare the interpretation to the king. And so that's what happens. Verse 17, then there's this prayerful response. Daniel goes to his house and he informs his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, here's the situation. The king's had a dream. He summoned everyone. He demands that we give him the contents and the interpretation. If we don't, we're killed. And so don't you love this? What do? Verse 18, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed. What do? They start to pray. They're facing death. They're in a situation where they can't fix it. So he responds wisely, and they start to pray. You see the application. What do? When you're in a situation, you start to panic. Do you try and fix everything? And do you try to take it into your own hands? And do you try to do everything you can? And the last resort is prayer? Oh, maybe we should pray about this. What's Daniel's first response? It's prayer. That's where he starts. He starts by praying, and he starts by bringing these needs and requests before the Lord. And you're going to see that this is what marks him through his ministry. Chapter 6, he's threatened and thrown in the lion's den. What does he do? He prays. Chapter 9, he prays. And so here's the marks of a godly person. You start to pray when things get tough. And it's not the last resort. It's not your last straw. It's where you start, okay? Third response is a worshipful response. Verses 19 to 23. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And Daniel answered and said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. And it is he who changes times and epochs, and he who removes kings and establishes kings. And he gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It's he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you've made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. So there's this wise response, there is this prayerful response, and then there is this worshipful response. God tells them the mystery, he tells them the dream and its interpretation, and the first thing Daniel does is he bows in worship. He responds, and look what he praises God for. He praises God, verse 20, for his wisdom. He praises God, verse 20, for his power. He praises God, verse 21, for the fact that he sets kings and rulers in place, and it is he who removes kings and establishes kings. He praises God in verses 20 and 21 for his revelation and his help in understanding these things. And so what erupts from his heart is praise and worship. And so I would ask you, when you pray and God answers, what's the first thing you do? You just head off and say, oh, that was great, that worked out. Or do you bow your head and you get on your knees and do you thank God for that answer to prayer? Here's a man who understood who answered his prayers and who cared for him and who provided the interpretation. And his first response is worship, praise, and adoration. And, it's just a reminder to us, you're going to be in difficult situations. And you're going to be in situations where you can't fix it and you're not going to know what to do. But where do you turn in those moments? Do you turn to the Lord and do you trust him and do you pray? And when he provides an answer and helps you, do you worship him? Or do you just move on? I mean, you can just see the practical lessons here for us. So any thoughts on this so far? I know I'm kind of going fast through this stuff, but I want to get to the end of the chapter.
Did his friends not have the gift of interpretation, do you think? I mean, it doesn't really mention that they understood the dream either. It just says it was given to Daniel.
Yeah. That's a good question. It says back in chapter 1, so the question is, do his friends not have the same gift of interpretation? Back in chapter 1:17, it says God gave them, all four of them, knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom, and Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. It's unique to him. It seems like it's unique to him. Now they're still gifted. They're still intelligent, that God has blessed them with an ability to understand these kinds of things. But it seems like there is a unique gift given to Daniel himself to interpret these kinds of things. And that's what you see in chapter 4. That's what you see in chapter 5. It's Daniel interpreting the visions. Terry?
I think it's interesting too that Daniel didn't go it alone. He called his friends in.
Yeah.
For moral support and to pray with him.
It's great.
I think that's significant.
Absolutely. He didn't try to do this on his own. He brought his friends with him to help him in this trial. So let's move on. Page 56, there is this introduction to the dream. So he's getting close now to giving us the content and the interpretation. And so verse 24, so Daniel went in. He has the dream now. He goes to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men. And he says, don't destroy us. Take me to the king's presence. Don't you love that? Confidence, boldness. When you know God is with you, there's boldness. When you know God is on your side and you have God's blessing on your life and ministry, you can approach any situation with boldness and confidence. And that's what he does. So verse 25, Arioch brought Daniel to the king. He says, I found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known. Don't you love that? Just previous, they're saying, nobody can do this. Not one person. There's nobody that can provide an interpretation. But there's this guy, Daniel. He shows up. So the king answers and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, look at this. I love this. Verse 28. There is a God. Don't you love that?
He agrees with the Chaldeans.
Yeah.
There is no.
Yeah, he actually does agree with the Chaldeans. There is no one who can do this, but there is a God who helped me understand it. That's what you're getting at, right? There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. So he's about ready to tell him. And I love that statement. Who's the hero of the book of Daniel? It's God. It's not Daniel. He's a great man, godly man, a man of integrity, a man of character, but the true hero of the book of Daniel is God himself. And so there is a God. And just, again, by application, can you say that? Are you in a situation in your life where whatever you're struggling with or you're dealing with, you can see through the fog and you can say, no, but there's a God? And I think we need to preach that to ourselves, because sometimes we get stuck in these life circumstances and we get so focused on the things before us and our eyes kind of get focused on the horizon and we don't lift them up and they see the Lord, and we get so focused on our situation and our trials and our difficulties, and we kind of buy the same lie. There's no one that can handle it. There's no one that can do this. And the question would be, but do you remember that there is a God? And he's your God, and he can sustain you and help you through that. So many implications from this. So he now comes to verse 31. Here it is. And this is where we want to spend the next hour. And we want to really dive into the content and the interpretation. All right, so here it is. Verse 31. Here's what the king saw. And Daniel says, O king, you were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found, but the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. There's the dream. Now, why is Nebuchadnezzar agitated and troubled by this dream? What we're going to get to this, but what's going on here? What's he about to learn and find out?
That he's not in charge.
He's not in charge.
He's coming to an end.
Exactly. Here's the king of the world. Here's the guy who's in charge of the most significant nation on the earth at that time. And he knows that something's about to change and that this thing's not going to last forever. And so he can't figure out all the details, but he knows something is not good for him because of what this dream means for him. All right, so here's the contents of the dream. Look at the bottom of page 56. Just some things I want you to notice about this, and then we'll get into its interpretation. The first thing I want you to notice is that it's a large statue, probably in human form, as described, obviously in human form, describing what would happen when the Gentile nations ruled the earth. And so he says it's a splendorous, is that a word? It's an extraordinary splendor, this statue is, and it's awesome. Verse 31 says it's awesome. And then he describes it for us. It's a statue with a gold head, silver breast and arms, bronze abdomen and thighs, iron legs, and iron and clay feet. Top of page 57, there's a few other things I want you to notice about this. Only the head is a united whole. The rest of them are divided. So you have the head, a singular unit, and then the rest of the statue is divided up. So you have the next section down is chest and arms. The next section below that is abdomen and then thighs. The next section below that is then iron legs and feet. So one is united, the rest of those parts are divided. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then I want you to notice that there is a descending order in the metals from top to bottom concerning the wealth, and there's an ascending order in the metals as to their strength. So just notice there's a little chart I put in there. As you go from top to bottom, you have decreasing wealth but increasing strength. So you start from the top, head of gold, which is more valuable than silver, which is more valuable than bronze, which is more valuable than iron. So you have decreasing wealth as you go down the statue, but you have increasing strength as you go down. So gold is the least strong, silver then is the second strong, bronze more strong, and then iron is the strongest. And so you have decreasing wealth, increasing strength. So there is some things to notice about this. The other thing I want you to notice, and then we'll get into it here, verses 34 and 35. You've got these different parts, but then after these parts have existed, verse 34 says there's something that's going to happen to this statue. There's a stone that's going to come that was cut without hands, and it's going to strike the statue on its feet, and it's going to crush them, crushing the feet. And then verse 35 tells us that with that, the whole statue is going to come down. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold are all crushed at the same time, and they become like chaff, the stuff that you thresh, and after you get the wheat out, it's all the crumbs that are left over and just blows away in the wind. That's what's going to happen to the rest of this statue and these kingdoms. And the wind's going to carry it away, and not a trace of them will be found. But the stone that struck the statue becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. That's very significant. We're going to come back and talk about that in just a few moments. On the bottom of page 57 is a picture, perhaps, of what he might have seen. And so you've got this head of gold. You've got these chest and arms of silver. You've got the belly and the bronze and thighs of bronze. You've got the legs of iron, and then legs of iron and clay. And then you've got this crushing rock that comes and destroys that whole thing. And you can see under there what they each represent, which is what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so any questions? We're still dealing with the contents here, but any questions so far? All right, then let's dive into this. The interpretation of the dream. And this is where we want to spend the rest of our time here. So verse 36, this was the dream. Now we should tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. So what I love about prophetic passages is sometimes God will be gracious to us and actually tell us very clearly what it means. So we don't need to read into it. We don't need to look for hidden meanings. We don't need to spiritualize it. We just need to let the text speak for itself. And so very clearly, we have this very clear statement. You are the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar, you're the gold. You're the head. And so this is the first kingdom. Actually, before we get to that, let me read a couple things up top of page 58. The main point of this chapter is this. If you want to get chapter 2, you need to understand this sentence right here. This is very important. The main point of this chapter is that starting with Babylon, there would be 4 major Gentile powers that would rule over the world and Israel. But a day is coming when God's kingdom will suddenly crush these kingdoms and will establish itself over the earth forever. If you get that, you've got Daniel chapter 2. This has thrown a lot of people. A lot of people are confused by the book of Daniel. I just talked to someone this weekend and told them I was teaching Daniel, and they said, I just don't get the book. I just don't get the whole book. It's just so confusing. And it is hard. It's a difficult book, but here it's so clear. He tells us what it is, and this is the point of the whole chapter, that he's telling them and he's telling us that there would be 4 major Gentile powers from the time of Daniel all the way taking us to the time when God's kingdom will crush those kingdoms and establish itself over the earth forever. So this vision contains, just a couple bullets down, in one panoramic sweep, the history of human civilization from the days of Nebuchadnezzar to the end of time. That's what makes this such a significant prophecy. You've got a statement in this one chapter about the whole history of human civilization from 605 BC all the way till Christ establishing his earthly and then eternal kingdom. So, listen, we know how it ends. You understand that? We know how it ends. The end times are not ambiguous. The end times are not this weird, goofy, unknowable, no one can figure this out, it'll all pan out in the end, God will figure it out. No. God has told us how it ends, clearly. And so we don't need to be confused about it. I understand the difficulty of prophetic passages and all the figurative language and the symbolism, but in this one chapter, you've got the whole picture of the end times. And now there's interpretive issues and how we interpret it, but he tells us how it ends. And we'll look at that in just a moment. All right, so that's what's going on here. One other quote here just below this, that where I just read, kings and kingdoms, presidents and dictators, democracies and monarchies come and go and enter the landfill of history. That's a great way to say it. Nations come, nations go. Presidents come, presidents go. Rulers come, kings come, they all go. They're all going to wind up in the graveyard of history until Christ comes. And that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, one other thing I want you to notice about this interpretation, verses 37 and 38 deal with the first kingdom, so they get 2 verses. 39 describes the second and third kingdoms. They get half a verse each. And then verses 40 to 43 speak of the fourth kingdom, and it gets 4 verses. So that's interesting, that the first kingdom gets 2 verses, the second and third kingdom get half a verse, the fourth kingdom gets 4 verses, and the final kingdom, Christ's kingdom, gets 2 verses, verses 44 and 45. Now, just think about that a little bit. That may tell us something significant about the fourth kingdom, and we'll take some time to explain that to you. There must be something significant about that fourth kingdom if it gets 4 verses, far more than any of the other ones. So we're going to talk about what that fourth kingdom is because it relates to what's going to happen prior to the coming of Christ in his kingdom. Are you tracking so far? Anyone confused? Okay. All right. Let's talk about the first kingdom. He's just told us, Daniel has, in verse 38, that this first kingdom is Babylon. He says in verse 38, you're the head of gold. And so there is no equivocation here about the interpretation of this first kingdom. It represents the nation of Babylon, which began in 626 BC when Nabopolassar defeated the Assyrians. Nabopolassar is Nebuchadnezzar's father, and he rose to power in 626 BC the nation came to a close. It was conquered in 539 BC. So the nation of Babylon existed for 87 years. And Nebuchadnezzar was ruler over Babylon for about half of that, for 43 years, from 605 BC to 562 BC. So I think I said earlier, it started in 605. It actually started in 626, but so Daniel, though, is interpreting this dream probably somewhere around 605. So Nebuchadnezzar's ruling over Babylon for 43 of those years. And he's represented here by the single head, representing the fact that he is Babylon. In a sense, he is the king over this entire country. He is what, in a sense, made the Babylonian Empire. Bottom of page 58 says, the same was not true of any other ruler of the succeeding empires, which explains why the three remaining Gentile kingdoms are called kingdoms. So he is really what made Babylon, Babylon. He was powerful, he was mighty, he was a great ruler militarily and politically. And so this first kingdom is represented by gold and is the kingdom of Babylon. Top of page 59, the reason it's represented by gold is because gold was the most distinctive metal that characterized the country, the nation. They built temples out of gold. They built gods out of gold. They built palaces out of gold. They made furniture out of gold. And so it's very appropriate that they are represented by gold because they were known by their gold. And you're going to see as we go through this that each nation is known by its metal that represents it. Does that tell you something about God's ability to prophesy the future? Remember, we started this whole class and we said there are critics who don't believe that there is supernatural predictive prophecy. And yet, how do we have the fact that God knows what metal would represent each nation? It's because he's sovereign and he's aware of those things. All right, so that's the first kingdom. Kingdom number one is Babylon. Kingdom number two, the second kingdom, is referred to in verse 39. He says, after that, or after you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. So here's the second kingdom. It's referring here to the next nation that overtook the Babylonians, known as the Medo-Persians. So Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians, were the nation that together took over the Babylonians. And so they're represented by a silver breast and arms, or silver chest and arms. They were inferior, verse 39 says, not in strength, but in wealth. So that tells us something, that Medo-Persia lacked some of the glory. It lacked some of the, maybe the beauty or something like that. But it was actually stronger than the Babylonians because we know that silver is stronger than gold. And we know that because they actually overtook the Babylonians. 539 BC, they came and destroyed the Babylonians, and they're now the nation in charge after Babylon. And so they rule until 331 BC. So think about this with me. 605 BC to 539 BC is 87 years. And then from 539 BC to 331 BC, 208 years, you have the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And so they're represented by silver because they were known by their use and their love of silver. In fact, they even required that taxes be paid in silver. And so very interesting that that was an appropriate metal to refer to them. You say, how do you know that that's Medo-Persia? Because it doesn't tell us. And you're right, this passage here does not tell us it's Medo-Persia, but chapter 8 will tell us it's Medo-Persia. And we know human history and secular history that the nation that overtook Babylon was Medo-Persia. So in case you're wondering how we know that it's that nation, chapter 8 will specifically tell us that it is, and then we also know that from secular history.
So the other prophets mentioned Medo-Persian Empire?
Yeah, possibly. Isaiah might have mentioned, Jeremiah might have mentioned him.
Because they talk about the fall of Babylon and
Yep.
nations.
Yep, absolutely. Third kingdom is referred to at the second half of verse 39. Another kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth. So here's this third kingdom, and Daniel tells us what that kingdom is. It is the nation that conquered the Medes and the Persians, which was Greece. So Greece takes over as the nation. They conquered the Medes and the Persians in 331 BC, and they ruled until about 146 BC. So about 185 years. By the way, think about this with me. Babylon made it 87 years. Medo-Persia made it 208 years. Greece makes it 185 years. How long's America been around? About 240. So I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I can tell you that nations typically don't last for more than a couple 100, 300 years. Rome's an anomaly. We'll talk about that in a minute. They lasted quite a bit longer than that. But nations tend to not make it beyond 200-300 years. Nations tend to implode. Nations tend to compromise in certain areas, and they begin to implode from within. And so, again, I'm not saying what's going to happen to America, but I'm saying we're watching our country implode from the inside out. Are we not?
Yeah.
We're watching the family be destroyed. We're watching marriage be destroyed. We're watching a nation essentially turn its back on God. And don't for 1 minute think that God's going to continue to bless this nation as it turns its back and shakes its fist in his face.
No way. Yeah.
Not going to happen. So we'll be around for a long time, longer time. I'm not saying we're going to be destroyed here in the next generation, but I am telling you, history tells us what happens to nations who reject God. And we're on a serious downslope as a country. I don't need to give you a bunch of examples of that. You know that. So, interesting side note. So here we have this third kingdom, the kingdom of Greece. And notice verse 39, it says, this kingdom will rule over the whole earth. Do you know that's exactly what happened? Who was the main leader in Greece? Alexander the Great. And so Alexander the Great rises to power, and he essentially did that. He came to the throne when he was 20, and he essentially conquered the world. If you know history and you've read about Alexander the Great, you know that he marched all over the then known world and essentially conquered it. He, all the way from Egypt and Europe to India. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And he was undefeated in battle and is still considered one of history's most successful military commanders. Top of the next page, while in the 20s, when there were no more lands for him to conquer, he is said to have wept because he conquered all the world that he could conquer. So he essentially did what was prophesied of him, that he would rule over the whole earth. And we're going to see more about him in chapter 8. In fact, I put a note there towards the top of page 60. Note, a clear identification of the second and third kingdom is given to Daniel in chapter 8, verses 20 and 21. So turn over there, just so you know I'm not making this up. Look over to chapter 8, verses 20 and 21. And there's another vision. This is a vision that Daniel will have. And as God helps him understand that vision, look at verse 20. The ram which you saw with 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia, and the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. So he tells us. Okay, he tells us exactly what those kingdoms were, and we know that those kingdoms are these second and third kingdoms that Daniel is describing here in chapter 2. So I'll explain that to you when we get there, but just trust me that that's the same kingdoms that we're talking about here, the second and the third kingdom. And so here we have these 3 kingdoms. we have these clear definition and identification of who and what these kingdoms are. Okay, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Good so far? Questions? Concerns?
They conquered China too.
The Greeks? I'm not sure they made it that far.
Usually in India. It's usually
Yeah.
in India, but China.
Yeah, I don't know how. I know they made it to India. I'm not sure how far the past they made it, and I'm not sure how much of the world at that point is still a significant portion of the world. He really did conquer most of the existing world. Yeah, Joe.
He wanted to keep going, but his troops were sick of it, so they said, "No, I'm going."
They were done. Okay. Interesting. All right, we need to spend some time on this fourth kingdom because this is where it gets a little dicey. This is where it gets, in my mind, very interesting, and I love this, and I want you to track with me if you can, because he spends 4 verses, and I think the fact that he spends 4 verses on this kingdom shows that there are some significant events that occur related to the fourth kingdom. So look at verse 40. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. What nation are we referring to here? Rome. This is the Roman Empire. So we know from history that somewhere around 146 BC, Rome comes and destroys Greece. And just look at a couple notes here. Rome conquers Greece in 146 BC, and they were the dominant world power for over 600 years in the West, until about 476 AD, and then until almost 1500 AD in the East. So remember the 2 parts? Remember I told you Babylon, one united entity, and then Medo-Persia, chest and arms, 2 separate kingdoms, or 2 parts of the same kingdom, Medes and the Persians. And then we have the Greeks, represented by thighs and abdomen, 2 thighs. We have that kingdom that eventually split, and which we'll talk about later. And now you have the Roman Empire, represented by 2 legs, which we know from history had 2 parts to it, an eastern part and a western part. And the eastern part made it to almost 1500 AD, and the western part made it till about 476 AD. So, as I said, they're an anomaly. They lasted a lot longer than other nations do. And so here's this kingdom represented by iron. And we know that the Romans were known for their iron. They were known as the Iron Armies. They had their helmets made out of iron, their shields were made out of iron, their swords were made out of iron. Their whole armies were essentially clad in iron. So it's very appropriate, once again, that they are known and identified by their iron, very appropriate for them. Now, so look at verse 40. I just read it. And what you need to know is that Rome essentially crushed Greece. It says that the iron, which is the strongest of all those metals, look at the verbs that are used in verse 40. Crushes, shatters, breaks, crush, breaks. These terms that are just speaking of just absolute power and might. And so that's how Rome came in and conquered the Greeks. They really did crush them with their power. Bottom of page 60. They crushed all the empires that had preceded it by swallowing up the lands and the peoples that had been parts of the 3 previous empires, assimilating them into itself. Because of that, Rome was probably the strongest empire the world has ever known. Okay, so very powerful force, very powerful empire. They were well-trained, well-equipped, strong leaders, well-defined policies. And because of that, they were able to pull off Pax Romana. You've heard of that before, Roman peace. They were able to keep the peace in the Roman Empire for many centuries because of their military power and their military might. So very strong nation for many centuries. Now it gets real interesting. Because in verse 41, we have something introduced here that tells us that there's some weakness in this kingdom. Let me read verses 30, go back up to verse 33 first. It speaks of its legs of iron, which we just talked about, and its feet, partly of iron and partly of clay. Now Daniel interprets that for us, starting in verse 41. And he says, in that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. So we move from legs of iron to feet with iron and clay in them. He says it will be a divided kingdom. But it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with the common clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. So you've got this massive, powerful Roman entity that is mentioned in verse 40, but then you've got a part or a phase of the Roman Empire mentioned in verses 40 to 43 that have some weaknesses introduced into it. Have you ever tried to put your molding clay together with a piece of metal and try and mix it all together? It doesn't work, does it? Because clay doesn't stick to iron and vice versa. So he's telling us something significant about this, that part of it's going to be strong, verse 42, and part of it is going to be weak. And so look at the middle of page 61. The feet and the toes portion of this image is not a fifth kingdom. Okay, so listen to this very clearly. Kingdom 1, head, Babylon. Kingdom 2, chest and arms, Medo-Persia. Kingdom 3 is Greece, represented by the belly and the thighs. And then kingdom 4 is represented by the legs. This is not a fifth kingdom. You don't have a fifth kingdom here associated with the feet. It's all part of the same fourth kingdom, right? So you've got this part of the Roman Empire. Now here's the question. This is very critical, is this all referring to the same Roman Empire that exists all at the same time? Or could there be different phases to this Roman Empire? And I believe it's the latter. So let me explain this to you. Look in your notes. I think what Daniel's getting at here is he's pointing to two parts of the Roman Empire. You have number one, the first part, the legs, referring to the first phase of the Roman Empire from 146 BC to 476 BC. And that's known as Rome 1, or what we would call Rome 1. And then you have number 2, the feet and the toes, referring to a future revived Roman Empire that we would refer to as Rome 2. So you have Rome 1 symbolized by the legs of iron, which was very strong and very powerful. And you have Rome 2, which is symbolized by the feet and the toes made of clay and partly made of iron, which will be made up of nations, some of which are strong and others which are weak. So the toes and the feet indicate the final form of the Roman Empire. So I believe what this is teaching is that you have in this final phase of the Roman Empire a 10-nation confederacy in this final phase of the Roman Empire. You say, why that? How many toes do you have? Actually, I want to know about this. Anyone have less than 10? No, don't admit to that. Not everyone has 10. Or more, maybe that'd be the better question. Most people have 10 toes. And so I think what you have here is a 10-nation confederacy, which represents the final phase of the Roman Empire, in which will be the final form of these Gentile kingdoms, which will ultimately be destroyed by the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's my thesis. That's, I think, what Daniel is saying as well. And so let me explain that a little bit more. The final future state of the Roman Empire will be a mixture of strength and weakness. Though it will be strong and able to conquer other enemies, like the iron that it's represented by, it will have inherent weaknesses, represented by the clay, indicating that this future 10-nation confederacy will have fatal flaws and human weaknesses, so that it will be inherently vulnerable. I think that's what you get in verse 43, where it talks about the seed of men. Notice verse 43. It says, in that you saw the iron mixed with clay, they will combine with one another, where? In the seed of men. So I believe what he's saying here is that this final phase of the Roman Empire is going to have kings and rulers in it, some of which are strong and some of which are weak, but will still comprise this 10-nation confederacy that makes up the final phase of the Roman Empire. It will not be like Babylon, which was ruled by a dictator, but rather it will be a confederacy with some weakened parts of it by the presence of weaker leaders. So my conclusion is that the fourth kingdom possesses two parts, Rome 1 and Rome 2. Now here's the question. When was Rome 1 and when is Rome 2? Daniel could not have known probably that there would be a gap between those two phases. He looks ahead, he interprets the vision, he interprets the dream, and he sees the legs and he sees the feet, and all he can see is that there's this fourth kingdom that is represented by legs and feet, and he can't see likely a separation between them. But I believe a gap exists between those two phases, and we can talk about that in a minute. Colleen.
In verse 41, is that what it means by a divided kingdom?
Yeah.
Yes, I always just assumed it was the potter's clay and iron, but is it divided as far as time?
Yeah, there's a few possible understandings of that divided kingdom. I don't think it's referring to the east and west part of Rome, because it's in the context of what I would say is Rome 2. So if you had put it in verse 40, I think that would have represented the eastern and western parts of the first phase of the Roman Empire. But because it's in verses 41 to 43, which is talking about the feet and the toes portion, it either refers to the fact that it's iron and clay together, and that's divided, or it could be referring to the fact that there's just division within this confederacy, some strong, some weak. So
not between the two phases.
I don't think it's referring to the phases here, no, because I don't think Daniel would have understood there to be two phases. Have I thoroughly confused you? Yeah. No? Are you still tracking? All right. Tim. Yeah, so Tim's raising the question, is the European Union a portion of this? And so let me just give you my conclusion. I believe Rome 1 took place from 146 BC to 476 AD. And that was the finalization. That's when Rome 1 went out of existence. And I believe we are presently in the gap between Rome 1 and Rome 2. And I believe that the Rome 2 phase is the future Gentile kingdom that will be in existence at the time of the tribulation upon the earth, which will then give way to the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's where I'm going to try and prove to you in just a moment. So there must be, if that's correct, and I think it is, not just because I'm saying it, because I think the Bible says it. Make that clear. Because I think that's what the Bible teaches, then there has to be some future reviving of that Western Confederacy, that Western nation, that Roman Empire. And so I believe that's still future. So there's going to have to be something like the EU, where they would come together under this conglomerate that unifies them in one entity. Is it the EU? I'm not sure it is, but it could be something like that. The euro, the fact that most of those nations in Europe are under one currency, the euro, I think gives some credence to the fact that there could be a revived Western Confederacy like what we're currently seeing. I'm not saying we're here now. I'm not saying that we're about to experience all this, but I'm saying that there's going to be some future reunification of this phase of the Roman Empire that might look like the EU and what we currently have with the use of the euro in that area. I don't think it's 10 nations. I don't know how many. It's probably more than that right now. Right.
But there's a lot of leftover Roman, Greco-Roman stuff that's a lot of the governments that are used to be democracy, but now they're republics or whatever, all come back from or go back to that Roman style of government.
Yeah, in a sense, this Roman Empire is still around. There's still vestiges of it today, not in the sense that we saw in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD, but there's still Italy and there's still Rome. Rome still is a power and is a place you can go visit it. There's still people who live in Rome. There's still people that exist in that culture. So I don't think it's a very hard leap to think about this being a future reality. So, Terry?
I think the second Roman part will encompass the whole earth, or most of the earth, or just that biblical region.
Yeah. Will it encompass the whole earth? I'm not sure it will encompass the whole earth. I think the 10 toes, and I'm going to show you why I think that in just a minute. I think the 10 toes represent 10 nations, 10 kings, 10 rulers, 10 national entities that make that conglomerate up. So obviously there's more than 10 nations in the world. So I think it's more just going to be defined by that 10-nation confederacy. There'll still be other nations in the world, but this final phase of this Gentile kingdom will be represented by those 10.
Probably getting ahead of you, but when the Antichrist, could that be the beginning of when he draws the world powers?
Yeah. Antichrist will be the ruler over this final phase of the Roman Empire. Yeah. And you'll have to wait till chapter 7, but that's what chapter 7 teaches. So Romans 13 teaches, or Revelation 13 teaches, that there is a final phase of this kingdom, Roman Empire, and Antichrist is ruler over it.
In Rome 1, there still were ethnic groups of people, even though Rome believed they were not necessarily nations, sovereign themselves, but their ethnic backgrounds certainly back to them.
Yeah.
So there it is. So it's just maybe there is 10 nations that rule the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not hard to imagine this. It's not at all difficult.
There's another element to keep in mind in the back of your thinking, and that is that this was one statue, top to bottom, and it's Gentile. And so there's an element that continues and is common to every stage of that.
Very good.
Because when the stone cut out without hands comes to crush it, the whole statue is crushed at once.
Yes. So there's something, what he's saying is this statue is one entity, and there must be something uniquely Gentile about this whole entity, that the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ comes and actually overpowers, destroys, completely puts out of existence when he sets up his kingdom. So there has to be a final phase of a Gentile kingdom in existence when Christ comes and establishes his earthly throne in order for the prophecy in Daniel 2 to be true. That's what you're saying, right?
Right. When he comes, the whole statue
is
annihilated.
Exactly. So look on the top of page 62. And this is kind of a visual picture. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if you've understood nothing of what I said so far, hopefully you can understand this. Here's what we're saying. Gold represents Babylon, silver represents Persia, brass represents Greece, legs made of iron and clay represent Rome 1 and Rome 2. It's one entity, it's one nation separated between Rome 1 and Rome 2 by a gap. And we're in that gap, and we've been in that gap now for 2,000 years. Okay, Daniel couldn't have seen that gap. He couldn't have known that it would have been a gap between those two phases, but that's where we're at. We're living right now between Rome 1 and Rome 2. Now, let me try to prove to you why that's the case and why I think that's the correct interpretation. under that little picture there, there's a couple reasons why we believe that there is a future phase, that verses 41 to 43 represent a future phase of the Roman Empire. First, number one, it's not listed as number one, but the existence of the future phase of the Roman Empire is confirmed by the fact that the fourth kingdom will be around when the stone destroys it and fills the earth. Okay, so understand this with me. Verses 34 and 35 say that there's going to come a stone which destroys all these earthly kingdoms. And verses 44 and 45, which we've not gotten to yet, also describe the stone, which is the kingdom of Christ, who comes and destroys this entire statue, and he strikes, the stone strikes the feet and the iron of clay, the feet of iron and clay. Verse 34 says it strikes the statue on its feet. So if the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ has to put down this fourth kingdom, it has to be in existence for it to be put down. Do you understand that? So you can't say that the fourth kingdom has been done away with, because it has to be in existence for Christ to come and destroy it. So that's one of the main reasons that we believe that verses 41 to 43 represent a future phase of that fourth kingdom, which we currently do not have in existence yet, although we see some of the seeds of it. And so it's viewed as still existing when the stone, which is Christ, smites it. So because that hasn't happened yet, here's my conviction. That hasn't happened yet. Christ has not established an earthly kingdom yet. He's not presently ruling and reigning on this earth yet. The kingdom of God has not come yet upon this earth. So that must be a future phase, and it must still exist in the future, because that's the kingdom that Christ comes and destroys. Second reason is the bottom of page 62. Furthermore, the existence of a future revived Roman Empire is corroborated by verse 44, which says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. So look at verse 44. I just read it. Very, very, very important. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Now, what kings is he referring to? I think he's referring to the 10 toes, which represent 10 kings. The reason I think that is for a couple of reasons. Has he mentioned kings, plural, yet in Daniel 2? Who's the only king that's been mentioned? Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 37, you, king, are the king. There's only one king that's been mentioned so far in Daniel 2. No king of Medo-Persia is mentioned, no king of Greece is mentioned, no king of Rome is mentioned. They're called kingdoms, but not kings. So how can verse 44 say, in the days of those kings, plural, if he's only mentioned one king, Nebuchadnezzar? Susan. The kings of Medo-Persia and the kings of Greece. Yeah, so it could be. In the day of, this is like the Gentile age. So maybe just wrapping that up. It could be. So this is where our amillennial friends, that's what they will say. Okay, so if you're an amillennialist, you're going to say that the kings in verse 44 represent all of those kings that were ruling in Babylon, Medo-Persia, Rome, Greece, etc. So the reason they have to say that, why do they have to say that? Exactly. They believe the kingdom is now. So in order for that system to work biblically, they have to interpret those kings as having already existed, and the kingdom being now, today. I don't buy that. I don't think that's correct, and I'm going to show you why in just a minute. Dale?
I've heard it said, some people think that rock is the church.
Yes.
That crushes.
Exactly. So if you're an amillennialist, okay, so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but here, if you're an amillennialist, you're going to say that those kings represent the kings of those four kingdoms, and the rock, which comes and destroys those kingdoms, is the church. And we are presently in the church age, and the kingdom is now. So that's how you'll interpret this passage if you're an amillennialist. I don't think that's correct. Here's why. So at the bottom of page 62, what kings are referred to here? The only king mentioned in this dream is Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold. The others are referred to as kingdoms, not kings. So what kings are in power when the God of heaven comes to set up his kingdom? I believe this can only refer to the 10 kings in the final form of the Roman Empire. The 10 toes represent 10 kings who are in power when God comes to establish his kingdom. Say, why do you believe that? Go to Daniel 7. Yep, exactly. Go to Daniel chapter 7, and this is where it makes that connection for us. So Daniel chapter 7. Remember I said that the chapters 2 and 7 are parallel. Chapters 3 and 6 are parallel. Chapters 4 and 5 are parallel. So chapters 2 and 7 are parallel. So we're going to go to chapter 7 because it is a parallel chapter. This is the dream of the four beasts. In verse 4, you have a lion described, which represents Babylon. Chapter 7, verse 5, there is this bear that is described, which represents Medo-Persia. Verse 6 is describing a leopard, which corresponds to Greece. And then verse 7, look what this says. After this, here's the fourth beast. After this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large, what kind of teeth? Iron. What nation does that represent? Rome. It has large iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. How many horns?
10.
How many toes? 10 horns, 10 toes. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. Who's that? Antichrist. Now, where does it say that these are kings? Go to verse 24, Daniel 7:24. He tells us exactly what they are. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, look at the next 2 words. 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue these three kings. He tells us in verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings, plural. So now go back to chapter 2, verse 44. When he says in verse 44, in the days of those kings, I think Daniel is referring right there to the final phase of the Roman Empire, which will be the kingdom in place when Jesus Christ returns at his second coming. So that's my understanding. Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
If they're parallels, what's the purpose of the parallel? Like, why does he repeat himself?
Great question. So one of the literary devices used in Scripture to emphasize things is that structure. And so oftentimes writers will use that structure, number one, for emphasis, to emphasize something. And Scripture often emphasizes things over and over again to help us understand, but then also to direct our attention to very important features that he wants us to. So chapters 2 and 7 are parallel, emphasizing what's being taught there. 3 and 6 are parallel, emphasizing what's being taught. Chapters 4 and 5 are also parallel, but that's the center of that literary device. So number one, it's for emphasis. Number two, it's to create that literary structure to show us where he's emphasizing.
The eye of 2 witnesses, you establish truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting that the first repetition of that is a vision given to a Gentile king. The second vision is given to a Jewish prophet.
Good point.
So it's as if he's emphasizing it, but to 2 audiences. One to say, hey, Gentiles, the stone is coming, and you're not going to last. The other one is to the exiled people to say,
Very good.
He's going to set up his kingdom. He hasn't forgotten.
Yeah, to understand that. So chapter 2, the vision is given to Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 7, the vision is given to Daniel. Teaching the same thing, but one is given to the Gentile king, one is given to Daniel to communicate to the Jewish people what's going to happen. So that's another part of it.
And it's two perspectives. First one is man's perspective from an outward appearance, the value of metals, the power and strength and so forth. The second has to do with character.
Daniel's character.
Vicious beasts.
Yes.
Crush and destroy.
That's right.
God's perspective. So yeah, man's, God's perspective.
It's good.
On the same.
Very good. Look at the bottom of page 63. So what I've just tried to take you through is hopefully a description of why I think there's this future phase of this Roman Empire. Since nothing in history corresponds to a 10-nation Roman confederacy subdued by another king, which endures until it's succeeded by the kingdom of heaven, this must refer to a future revived Roman Empire in the days just preceding the second coming of Christ and his kingdom. So that's hopefully you can understand that. Go to the next page, and let me just show you, in visual picture, what we're talking about. Rachel just asked the question about the parallel nature of these two chapters. They are parallel. Chapter 2 is the statue. Chapter 7 is the beast. The head of gold correlates to the lion, referring to Babylon. The breast of silver correlates to the bear, corresponding to Persia. The thighs of bronze are similar to the leopard, referring to Greece. The legs of iron refer to the beast with the iron teeth. That's Rome. And then there is this feet of iron clay, which referred to a divided nation of Western Europe, which is equated by the 10 horns of the beast. So that's what we're referring to, and that's kind of how this all fits together. By the way, just so you know, Revelation confirms the fact that this final phase of the Roman Empire has 10 kings. So look in Revelation 13, verse 1, under that first picture. It says, the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming out of the sea having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horn were 10 diadems. Again, we have this 10-horned thing. So even Revelation picks up this 10-horned fourth empire. So again, I think this is all pointing to a 10-nation confederacy at the final age just before Jesus Christ comes. And this hasn't happened yet. Okay, we have not seen this in human history. There has not been a 10-nation confederacy that has made up the Roman Empire. And so that's another reason why we believe this is still future. All right, so quickly, verses 34 and 35. Now we come to this divine kingdom. So we've walked through the 4 Gentile kingdoms. The bottom of page 64, now we talk about this divine kingdom. And it's described for us in verses 44 and 45. And it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it was crushed, that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God who has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. So what's going to come and destroy this final phase of the Gentile kingdoms? It's going to be a stone. Verse 45 describes a stone. Verse 34 describes a stone. And did you know that the Old Testament and the New Testament both refer to Jesus as a stone? The stone of what? Stumbling and the rock of offense. And I put in the cornerstone. Ashley.
Could that be something to refute how the Catholic Church says I'm building church on Peter, so that could make it talking about himself as a stone instead of Peter?
Yeah, so in Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The Catholic Church takes the rock there as Peter. He was the first pope. And so I think there's 2 possible ways to view the stone there. Either the stone is Jesus, when he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Ephesians 2:20 would corroborate that, where it says that the foundation of the church is built on the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. So that is a very good possibility. It's also possible that the rock is Peter, but not in a Catholic sense. And I actually wrote a paper in seminary on that and took that position, that the rock is Peter. So when Jesus says, "You are the rock, and on this rock, you, Peter, I will build my church." The reason it could still be Peter, but not as the first pope, is that who was the very first apostle in the book of Acts to go proclaim the gospel? It was Peter. Just read Acts chapters 3, 4, 5. Who stood up on Pentecost in Acts 2 and preached the gospel? It was Peter. So I still think it could be Peter, but not the way the Catholic Church views it. Good question.
Doesn't that verse have two different words for stolen rock? Yeah.
It does have two different words. Yeah, one is Petros, and the other one is Petra. Yeah, different.
Which one means small, one means large, or is that not true?
Yeah, there's a slight nuance in those meanings. That's what's contributed to the difficulty in interpreting that. There's multiple interpretations, but I think those are two possibles. So Jesus in the Old Testament is referred to as the stone. Jesus in the New Testament is referred to as the stone. Jesus in Luke 20 refers to himself as the stone. So I think we're on safe ground here to say that the stone in verse 45 and in verse 34 is Christ himself. The stone that comes to destroy the final phase of the Gentile kingdom is Christ. He comes to establish his kingdom. He obliterates all human kingdoms in one sudden, instantaneous, crushing blow. And he comes and completely wipes out all the nations. He destroys them. He reduces them to rubble. He crushes them such that they actually go out of existence. That's what verse 34 and 35 talk about. So look at this quote towards the bottom of page 65. Just a second, Matt. Kind of in the middle of page 65. "It is significant that the smiting stone crushes not only the feet and the toes of the iron and the clay, but also the entire image." John, I think you mentioned this earlier. Christ comes and destroys the whole image. This is historically, culturally, and religiously accurate. Just as the Silver Kingdom absorbed Neo-Babylonian religion and cultures into itself, so also Alexander the Great adapted Greek culture to Persian culture, and finally, Rome did not annihilate the religious, philosophic, and cultural aspects of the various Greek and Hellenistic kingdoms, but incorporated them into the multifaceted empire called Rome. However, at the second coming of Christ, there will be no absorbing, no adapting, no modifying, no merging, and no restructuring of previous kingdoms. There will be total destruction. And so every trace of gold, silver, bronze, as well as iron and clay influence will be removed from the earth by the Lord Jesus Christ. I love that. Jesus is not coming to kind of tweak things and, massage things, and we'll take a little of this and a little of that. No, he is coming to completely destroy earthly kingdoms to set up his kingdom. Matt, what were you going to say?
Honestly, yeah, just another thing, looking to the stone as Christ. Think of like this statue, every part of like the statue you think is formed by man. And it said twice that this is a stone cut without hands. There's no human involvement.
Exactly.
The stone at all.
Exactly.
Part of the statue had been formed.
Exactly. So here's the question, great segue. What does it mean the stone cut without hands? What is that referring to? It could refer to Christ's virgin birth. Christ did not come into this world through the normal processes of human regeneration. He came in through the virgin birth. So that is a possible meaning of the fact that he was cut without hands. It also could refer to the fact that his kingdom is not of this world. John 18:36, remember what Jesus says? He says, "My kingdom is not of this world." So it's very possible it could refer to either or both of those. So you have this King Christ coming to absolutely annihilate earthly kingdoms, and that's what we believe is a future event. Now, as I said, amillennialists think that's already happened. Amillennialists, our Reformed brothers and sisters, believe this has already taken place. And they believe the church is the kingdom that Christ has set up in his first coming. And I don't think that's the case at all. But
It's so imperfect.
yeah, I'll show you some reasons why, and we're going to run out of time, so you're going to have to wait till next week on that. But I don't think that's what it means. I think it's meaning a future. There's still a future phase of the Roman Empire. Christ is coming in his second coming to annihilate that final phase of the Roman Empire with Antichrist as its head. And when he comes in his second coming, he will establish a literal, earthly, political kingdom on this earth. And so that's why I do not think it's already happened in the form of the church. Okay. Let me wrap up with this real quick, and then I'll let you go. Verse 45, the bottom of page 65. What is this mountain? Look in verse 45. It talks about this mountain. And back in verse 35, it talks about this mountain that fills the whole earth. And I think what you have here is a description of this coming kingdom of God. Top of page 66. Mountain is often used in Scripture to refer to kingdoms and governments. And so I think this is a reference to the coming literal earthly kingdom of Jesus Christ, which will take over all Gentile kingdoms, will destroy all earthly human rulers, and he will establish his kingdom that does literally what verse 35 says it will. It fills the whole earth. Jesus Christ is coming back to establish a kingdom that will envelop all of human history and all of, not history, but all of human events on this planet when he returns.
Would the Battle of Armageddon occur at the same time that this crushing of the rocks?
Yes. So the Battle of Armageddon at the end of the tribulation is the event that brings this all to a head, and Christ crushes it and destroys those earthly nations, Gentile nations, in that battle. Yep. Yeah, Rachel?
So are the kingdoms like kind of so they won't fall until Christ comes back, or they can start falling like one at a time, or are they all gonna it's like one fell swoop and they're just gone? I'm just trying to get like the timing.
It's one foul swoop. So what's that?
But when Christ comes back before he comes, like it's not like a leading up to Christ coming.
Correct. So this final phase of the Roman Empire, 10 nations, that's the conglomerate that will be in existence when Christ returns at his second coming. And so he will come to return to destroy that 10-nation confederacy. That help?
Yeah. My second question is, do they have to be, when the Bible says kings, that they just like leaders, they can political like leaders, they don't have to necessarily like
Yeah. King, president, dictator, ruler. I mean, there's multiple terms that we could use for it, but they will be the leaders of those 10 nations, whether they're presidents or prime ministers or whatever. Joe?
So the ultimate inauguration would be the end of the millennial kingdom, because there's still unbelievers coming up in the millennial kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have the initial phase of the earthly kingdom in the millennium. Christ returns, establishes a 1,000-year earthly kingdom, which will then still have unbelievers within it. There's a final rebellion at the end of that 1,000 years. Christ puts that down, and then you have the new heavens and the new earth. Yeah, so in other words, we see two phases to the future coming kingdom of Christ. There is a literal earthly millennial 1,000 years, and then there is the eternal phase of that kingdom, which we'll have to talk about next week. So we didn't get to the last parts. Why don't you do this? I'd like you to read pages 66 through 69 for next week. Okay? I'd like you to read the readings in the book for chapter 3 next week, and I'd like you to read pages 66 through 69, and we'll have to wrap this up next week, and then we'll dive into chapter 3 next week. Okay? So thank you so much. A lot of material. I hope you're okay. See you next week.
I won't be able to sleep.
I just threw a lot at you.
Now you've got
Messing with you, right?
How are you?
He's the.
It's interesting because like
Yeah.
it almost feels like this pseudo Roman Catholic.